Sometimes you just get in these conversations and you're so frustrated, you just want to quit the world. And then third, we'll start talking about how you can make your arguments stronger by recognizing both where your opponent is failing to give their side correctly and where you yourself are failing to give a decent account. And then at the very end, we'll talk about what happens if none of this works. What should you do then? And I have to apologize. I think half of my presentation is missing because my flash drive is not a very good one. All right. So why arguments fail? And I've come up with 3 basic reasons why sometimes you just fail to convince people. Number 1 is miscommunication, and I think this is the most important one, and we'll go over these more. And antagonism, and I'll define what I mean by that, and also pride. So with miscommunication, let's look at this example. So if a tree falls in the woods, no one is there to Twitter about it. Does it make a sound? And of course, this is a variation on the classic argument. So you can see getting into an argument with someone about this, and I chose this fairly innocuous example that isn't something that you'd really get very angry about. But say that I'm in a conversation with somebody and they say, of course it makes a sound. Sound is just vibrations in the air. And I say, no, it's not. Sound requires a brain to process the auditory information. So who's right? And the answer is both of us, because we're both using different definitions of sound. My opponent is using one, and I'm using another. I'm defining it in such a way that there has to be somebody present in order to make it, in order for there to be a sound. So if we agreed on a definition of sound, there would be no disagreement at all. That's what comes to my next point. This is something that really bothers me, this phrase. It's just semantics. Don't ever say it's just semantics in an argument. It's semantics are the study of meaning, what words actually mean. And if you say it's just semantics, what you're saying is, I don't care about what the words I'm saying actually mean. We're just going to go back and forth on this, and there will be absolutely no way to ever resolve this debate. So don't say that. Tip 1. Second, define your words. Start out every argument knowing what you're actually arguing, what your position is, what your opponent's position is, and how you're using the words that you're using. If somebody says, well, I believe abortion is wrong, talk about what wrong means. And if someone says, I believe God exists, well, what do you mean by God? So philosophers spend a lot of time doing just this. I would say the majority of the time. And it can really get kind of boring sometimes. But it's like when you go into a psychiatrist's office and you sit down on their couch and they ask you, well, how do you feel about life? It's a really annoying question, and sometimes you just don't want to hear this, but it's really important just so you can get down to the fundamentals of what you're actually talking about. And antagonism. So a lot of times when you go into an argument, especially with somebody that you absolutely disagree with on principle, you think that they're a horrible person for having the views that they do, it's really easy to feel a lot of anger towards them. And that anger can lead to assuming right off the bat that everything that they say is going to be just wrong. And that's a bad position to take because sometimes, even if their conclusions are wrong, some of their premises might not be. And you're digging yourself into a hole if you say, if you disagree with everything they say right off the bat. So that goes back to understand what you're really disagreeing about. Are you disagreeing about the premises? Are you disagreeing about the conclusion? Are you disagreeing about both? And like I said, it's really easy to get into situations like you have somebody like this that is just spewing the most inane shit that you can ever imagine, and your blood boils over and you just want to hit them with something. And then finally, pride. When you're somebody like I'm sure most of the people here are, who's very thoughtful and considers all your positions very deeply before you ever talk to somebody about it, what? Yeah. No. then it's really easy to get into a mindset where you're like, I've studied this. I'm a graduate student in philosophy. I know what I'm talking about. I'm a professor. I've read so many things about this. And you know that your opponent hasn't done that research. And so it's really easy to start thinking, I'm right because I have this background. And I've actually encountered this before. Actually, Jeff in the back was getting into an argument with somebody who had her master's degree in philosophy, and she used that as an excuse to tell him why he was wrong. So avoid pride. Yes, it's easy to get caught up in it, but it's a very bad mistake to make. And then finally, or next, how to not lose your shit when you're actually having these conversations. And the first is lower your expectations. You are just not going to dismantle somebody's worldview, entire worldview, in one conversation. It's not going to happen. And one way you can lower your expectations is by not going after their foundational belief. So maybe if you're talking with somebody who's a fundamentalist Christian, who has all these really far out ideas that you disagree with, the best idea is not to go after their belief in God, because that's one thing that you are not going to shake. You might talk about one of their specific beliefs. Should we teach creationism in science classrooms? And then you can talk about the separation of church and state and why that's important, and why creationism isn't a scientific worldview. So go after the small fish. Second, it's not about you. When you get into these debates, you think that at the end of the day, it's going to be about whether you win or not. And if you don't win, then you failed. So you're very committed to the right outcome of the debate, and that can make you blind to a lot of other things happening in the conversation that can just trip you up and dig you into a hole. Third, enjoy the discussion. And like I said, sometimes it's hard. But for nothing else, you can enjoy the satisfaction of knowing that you're clarifying your own view. You're only responsible for yourself. You're not responsible for what the other person says or thinks, but you are responsible for how you do the argument on your end. And you can take pride in the fact that you're really making yourself better. You're learning how to talk to people and learning how exactly they come to their own conclusions, which will benefit you in every future debate. And fourth, think of yourself not as opponents, but as a team. And this sounds sort of cliche and silly, but what you really want to be after is the truth. That's what you're looking for. You're looking for the truth, and give the other person the benefit of the doubt and hope that they're looking for the truth too. And so you don't have to feel, prideful that you, or discouraged when you lose. You've learned something from it. You've gotten that much closer to the truth, even if it's just a tiny bit. I actually wanted to say something more about number one. Sometimes a lot of arguments don't ever seem to go anywhere. And that's what I was talking about with going after the small fish. Sometimes it's not about even getting them to change their mind about something small. It's about planting that seed of doubt. And it might take years and years for anything to come about that. When I was just starting in college, I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian household. And I had all these views about why homosexuality is wrong, and why abortion is wrong. And I remember the exact sentence that planted that seed of doubt. And this might not seem very convincing to most of you, but somebody said, when I got into discussion with somebody else on my freshman floor, if God were really the truly caring person that you say he is, he wouldn't mind you questioning these beliefs. And I don't remember how that argument ended. It was certainly not with any admission on my part that my beliefs were wrong. Yeah, but that idea festered in my mind. And slowly I began opening up to other possibilities, other beliefs. And my belief in God was not the first thing to go. It was my belief about the separation of church and state, for example, the belief about creationism. And now 5 years later, I'm talking at a skeptic conference. So it can take a long time, but it does eventually make a difference. That is messed up. Okay, I think think this is where the slide starts getting funky. Second, to get to the third point, know why your opponent's argument is bad. And an opponent's argument can be bad for two reasons. It can be a failing of fact, or it can be a failing of reason. So some facts that they might get wrong. The Earth is 6,000 years old. There's empirical evidence to that effect, and that's what you want to go to. You want to have your sources that show why that's an implausible idea. And if you're arguing over this, you should have those sources, and you should have a very clear idea of what the debate is about these facts. Another, vaccines cause autism, and then Justin Bieber's amazing. That's it. But sorry about that. The second way their argument can fail is a failing through reason. They could have all their facts straight, and they could still be making some very basic logical mistakes. And this is what I teach in my intro logic class, in which we'll get to later on in the semester. But what we're really talking about is fallacies, and it's really important to know your fallacies, both so you don't make them, and so you can recognize when another person is making them. Sometimes when the person you're talking to just says something and it sounds dumb. You don't know how to respond to that. You don't know why it's dumb, you just feel it's dumb. But if you really study these fallacies and how they're made, you can have a much better idea of when your opponent goes wrong. Just to give some broad ideas, there's fallacies of relevance. Sometimes what your opponent is using as justification for their conclusions are things that are actually irrelevant to the conclusion itself. So an ad hominem attack is an example of this. I don't believe you because you don't take showers. And whether or not you take showers is completely irrelevant to the fact that of what you're arguing. And there can be fallacies of ambiguity. And this goes back to defining your words correctly. Sometimes you can say things and it can be interpreted two ways. And the way that you mean it is not the way that you know that your opponent will interpret it. So those are just a few examples. There's a huge number of these fallacies, but just getting familiar with how fallacies are generally made will really help you out a lot of ways. Then finally, how to make your argument stronger. So I like to think of arguing, strategizing about arguments as sort of a level approach. There's the very basic first level, which is the most ineffective, and that's just blatant ad hominem attacks, going back and forth, not trying to define your words, assuming everything your opponent says is wrong. That's the very lowest level of arguing. And then at the top, it's where you really understand what your opponent is saying. And you not only understand it, but you know how to make it stronger. So you give them their best weapon. You make their argument as best as you can. And then you show why that leads to either logical inconsistencies or bad consequences. And if you defeat a position that's even better than the one they actually held, that's the very strongest type of argument you can make. And there's other levels, but we don't really have time to go over them. And so, what if none of this works? Sometimes you're just going to get somebody who's not willing to play into your game. They're not willing to enter into a real discussion with you. They just want to shout at you. They just want to show you that they're right, but they're not willing to have any give and take at all. And really, it's depressing, but there's nothing to be done about those people. So keep your cool, be polite, and walk away. And that's really the best thing that you can do. And hopefully, you've presented your side well enough that